he could beat. Get the fuck out of here. They wouldn't ask no white guy to do no shit like that. They're not gonna ask Al Gore to run with Al Sharpton, no.
The White People's Choice Awards. You realize if they nominated host, I wouldn't even get this job.
I've been around for 50 years. I want to congratulate Lorne Michaels on 25 great years of Saturday Night Live. Man of extraordinary talents. Look at him. Look at that smile. Got that second wife happiness.
When Will Smith walked across the Oscar stage in March 2022 and struck Chris Rock in front of millions of people, the world saw just a slap. Chris saw entire decades collapsing on him in a single second. That frozen moment wasn't just about a poorly received joke or Hollywood egos colliding under the spotlight. It was about an 11-year-old boy being thrown against the concrete of a Brooklyn school, about a teenager who lost his father too early, about a man who spent 60 years trying to understand why he could never truly connect with the people he loved. The strange smile Chris showed after the impact confused everyone. It wasn't contempt, it wasn't courage. It was simply what his body learned to do when there's nothing left to do. That reflexive grin, twisted and uncomfortable, was the same defense mechanism he developed as a child when facing daily violence. It was the smile of someone who had learned long ago that showing pain only invites more of it. Chris Rock's story begins long before fame, in a time when Brooklyn meant survival. Born in 1965 in Andrews, South Carolina, his family moved to New York when he was still a child, and that's where everything got complicated. His parents, Julius and Rose Rock, were working-class people trying to give their children a better life than they had. Julius drove trucks, delivered newspapers, washed dishes, anything to keep food on the table. Rose took care of the home and eventually worked as a teacher and social worker. They settled in Crown Heights, then Bedford-Stuyvesant, neighborhoods that in the early 70s were among the most dangerous in America. This wasn't the gentrified Brooklyn of today, with artisanal coffee shops and boutique stores. This was a Brooklyn drowning in gang violence, racial tension, and economic collapse. The streets were controlled by whoever was willing to be most violent. Police presence was either oppressive or completely absent. For a small, shy black kid like Chris, every day outside felt like entering a war zone where the rules changed without warning. The 70s brought a school integration policy that seemed progressive on paper, but in practice meant putting black kids on buses for an hour to study in neighborhoods where they weren't welcome. The busing program was designed to desegregate schools and give minority students access to better educational resources. But nobody asked what it would feel like for those children to be sent into hostile territory every single day. Chris was 11 when he started attending James Madison High School in a predominantly white area. He was one of maybe a dozen black students in a school of hundreds. And from the very first day, he understood he wasn't a student there. He was an intruder. It wasn't ordinary bullying. It was systematic violence, fueled by racism that adults either couldn't or wouldn't stop. He was beaten almost every day for years. Groups of students surrounded him, punched him, kicked him, tore his clothes and threw him in trash cans. They called him names that cut deeper than any fist could. They made sure he knew he didn't belong, that he would never belong, that his presence was an offense to them. Teachers watched and looked away. To them, it wasn't problem enough for intervention. Some of them shared the same prejudices as their students. Others simply didn't want the trouble of standing up to racist parents and school board members. Chris absorbed that silent message, and it settled deep inside him. He learned that authority wouldn't protect him. He learned that being right didn't matter if you were powerless. He learned that surviving meant becoming invisible or becoming entertaining. And since invisibility was impossible when you're one of the only black faces in the room, entertainment became his only option. What people don't understand about trauma is that it doesn't just hurt, it teaches. And what Chris learnt was simple and terrible. If you make people laugh, maybe they won't want to hurt you. Comedy wasn't born from talent or passion. It was born from pure preservation instinct. Every joke he created, every timing he refined, every smile he forced were attempts to create invisible armor. He discovered he could control a room if he knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He studied people obsessively, watching how they reacted to different words, different tones, different gestures. He learned to read a crowd the way a soldier learns to read terrain. Where are the threats? Where are the exits? What do I need to say to make it through the next 5 minutes? And that skill, which the world would later call comic genius, was forged in the fear of being publicly destroyed. That's why humiliation has always been his red line. That's why the Oscar slap wasn't just embarrassing, it was a direct trigger for decades of buried pain. When Will Smith's hand connected with his face in front of a global audience, Chris's nervous system didn't register a celebrity dispute, it registered a threat in front of a crowd. And his entire body reverted to the scared kid, who learned that fighting back only makes things worse. During those brutal school years, Chris witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His closest friend was killed, murdered right in front of him. Chris has never revealed the full details of that incident, and perhaps he never will. But in the few times he's mentioned it, you can hear the weight of it in his voice. That moment taught young Chris Rock that death wasn't something distant or abstract. It was something that could happen in an instant, without reason, without warning, without justice. That fear of sudden erasure stayed with him. It became part of why he works so compulsively, why he pushes himself so hard, why he can never quite relax even at the height of success. It's always a voice in the back of his mind, reminding him that everything can disappear in a second. At 17, when most teenagers are still figuring out who they want to be, Chris had to figure out how to support a family. His father Julius died from complications related to a stomach ulcer at 57, leaving a widow and 9 children in a house that was already struggling. Julius had been Chris's only emotional anchor, the only one who understood the weight the boy carried. He was a quiet man, not given to long speeches or emotional displays, but he had a way of making Chris feel protected. When he left, Chris didn't have the luxury of processing grief. The family needed him to be strong immediately. He dropped out of high school, started working anywhere that would accept him, and carried the weight of being the man of the house without knowing how to be a man. He delivered newspapers, washed dishes, worked at Red Lobster, took any job that paid. Every dollar he earned felt like a small rebellion against the poverty that had defined his childhood. That loss created in him a permanent fear of disappearing without leaving a mark, of evaporating like the father who left too fast and too quietly. Julius Rock worked his entire life and had almost nothing to show for it when he died. No savings, no property, no legacy except the children he left behind. Chris watched his mother struggle to keep the family together and made a silent vow. He would not vanish quietly. He would not be forgotten. he would matter. That fear became fuel. Chris worked compulsively for the rest of his life, always chasing something that proved he was still here, that he mattered, that he wouldn't be forgotten. Even today, at 60, with more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, with a legacy secured in comedy history, he still pushes himself like a man running from a racer. It was on stage that he found oxygen. At 19, after watching Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor transform pain into power before drunken audiences, Chris decided to try. Murphy was only a few years older than Chris, but seemed to command reality itself when he held a microphone. Pryor, meanwhile, had turned his own destruction into art, speaking truths about race, poverty, and violence that nobody else dared to voice. Chris saw in them a possibility he had never considered, that pain could be currency, that suffering could be transformed into something valuable. His first performance was at Catch a Rising Star, a legendary New York club that had launched countless careers. It was disastrous. He shook, forgot lines, spoke too fast. His timing was off. His material was half-formed. But people laughed. Not the roaring laughter he would later command, but enough. Enough to tell him he was onto something. And in that laughter, he found something his childhood never gave him: control. On stage, nobody threw him against the wall. On stage, he dictated the pace. On stage, he was real. Comedy became church, painkiller, and refuge, but the price was high. Every joke required him to dissect his own wounds, to transform violence into entertainment, to show his scars for strangers to laugh at them. And the higher he climbed, the more he had to give of himself. The comedy clubs of the 80s were brutal proving grounds. You performed for drunks who didn't care if you lived or died. Hecklers would tear you apart just for sport. Other comedians were competitive to the point of sabotage. But Chris thrived in that environment because it was still gentler than his childhood. At least on stage, the violence was verbal. At least on stage, if you were good enough, you won. By the late 80s, people started noticing him. Eddie Murphy, by then a massive star from Beverly Hills Cop and 48 Hours, saw Chris struggling through a set and recognized something in him. He gave Chris a small role in Beverly Hills Cop 2 in 1987. It was barely more than a cameo. A few lines, blink and you miss it. But it was a door opening. Murphy became a mentor of sorts, someone who understood what it meant to be a young black comedian trying to break through in an industry that had very specific ideas about where you belonged. When he joined Saturday Night Live in 1990, Chris thought he had arrived. SNL was the dream. It was where Eddie Murphy had become a star. It was where every young comedian wanted to be. But he soon realized he was again the only black kid in a room full of people who saw him as supporting cast. The early 90s cast of SNL was legendary: Adam Sandler, Chris Farley, David Spade, Rob Schneider. They were the bad boys of comedy, pushing boundaries and getting away with it. But they were also all white, and the show's writers knew how to write for them. Chris, meanwhile, was consistently pushed into stereotypes. He played the angry black guy, the threatening black guy, the incomprehensible black guy. He rarely got material with depth or nuance. Writers didn't know how to write for him or didn't care to try. He felt like he was back in that Brooklyn school, present but invisible, tolerated but not welcomed. He pushed back when he could, tried to write his own material, fought for better roles. But SNL was a machine with its own momentum, and one person couldn't change it. He stayed for 3 years, 1990 to 1993, and left feeling defeated. Not because he failed, but because success there meant erasing too much of himself. He could have given up. Plenty of people told him he'd had his shot and missed it. But Chris Rock doesn't know how to give up. Instead, he disappeared into the comedy club circuit, performing in front of small crowds in dim rooms, rebuilding his voice from the ground up. He stopped trying to be what SNL wanted. He stopped trying to be Eddie Murphy or Richard Pryor. He started being Chris Rock, and Chris Rock had something to say. He talked about race with a precision that made white audiences uncomfortable and black audiences nod in recognition. He talked about relationships with a honesty that was both funny and painful. He talked about class, about masculinity, about hypocrisy, about the lies America tells itself. And in 1996, he released Bring the Pain, an HBO special that changed everything. Bring the Pain wasn't just a comedy special, it was a cultural earthquake. Chris talked about black respectability politics with a nuance that enraged some and liberated others. He dissected relationships, politics, and social hypocrisy with surgical precision. He was fearless, brilliant, and completely in control. The special won 2 Emmy Awards, landed on Rolling Stone's list of the greatest comedy specials of all time, and turned Chris Rock into the most important black voice in American comedy. Critics called him Richard Pryor's successor. Audiences called him a genius, but along with glory came a prison. Now he had to be brilliant always. He couldn't fail, couldn't be weak, couldn't be ordinary. Every special after Bring the Pain was measured against it. Bigger and Blacker in 1999, Never Scarred in 2004. Each one had to match or exceed what came before. The pressure to maintain that level of brilliance began devouring him from the inside. People see the finished product and think it comes icily. They don't see the months of writing, rewriting, testing material in small clubs, bombing repeatedly until you figure out what works. They don't see the self-doubt, the night staring at a blank page, the fear that you've lost whatever made you special. Chris worked harder than almost anyone in comedy because he was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. He wasn't naturally confident, he was naturally afraid, and he channeled that fear into perfectionism. Every word mattered, every pause mattered, every gesture mattered. By the time audiences saw him on stage, he had practiced each second of his set hundreds of times. That's not genius. That's survival instinct wearing a genius costume. In 1996, the same year Bring the Pain exploded, he married Molak Compton, a social worker who seemed to be everything he needed: stable, kind, understanding. She worked with underprivileged communities and had a groundedness that Chris lacked. She seemed like she could be the anchor he lost when his father died. But Chris didn't know how to be a husband. He didn't know how to give up control, didn't know how to express needs, didn't know how to read the emotional signals of the person beside him. He worked obsessively, traveled non-stop, and began seeking validation where he shouldn't. His career demanded constant touring, constant writing, constant performing. He convinced himself that providing financially was the same as being present emotionally. He was rarely home. When he was home, he was thinking about work. Molak tried to reach him, but it was like trying to hold water in your hands. And then came the affairs. He cheated multiple times. Later, he admitted he was addicted to hearing he was special, that he mattered. He said everyone is addicted to something, and his drug was validation. when you grow up feeling worthless, when you spend your childhood being told you don't belong, success doesn't fix that hole inside you. It just gives you more sophisticated ways to avoid feeling it. Chris filled that hole with applause, with strangers telling him he was brilliant, with women who made him feel desired. But none of it worked. The hole remained. The marriage crumbled. Molak found out about the affairs, and the foundation of their relationship shattered. They tried to work through it, went to counseling, made promises. But trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. The divorce lasted 2 years, from 2014 to 2016, and drained not just money, but any illusion that he could have a healthy emotional life. The financial settlement was reportedly massive, somewhere in the range of millions of dollars. But Chris rarely talks about the money. What destroyed him was the feeling of having failed. He lost the house, the stability, and the woman who believed she could save him. He lost his daughter's daily presence. Lola and Zara were still young, and suddenly he was a part-time father, seeing them on scheduled weekends, missing the small moments that make up a childhood. He admitted years later that he didn't know how to be a husband and wasn't great at being a father either. Not because he didn't love his daughters, but because he didn't know how to show up emotionally. He could perform for thousands of people, but he couldn't have a real conversation with his own family. It was after the divorce that he finally sought therapy, thinking he just needed to learn better communication skills. But in 2019, at 55, he received a diagnosis that rewrote his entire life: nonverbal learning disorder. NVLD is a neurological condition that makes it extremely difficult to read facial expressions, voice tones, and emotional nuances. People with NVLD can be highly intelligent, articulate, and successful in many areas, but struggle with the unspoken language that most people process automatically. Suddenly, everything made sense. The coldness people always saw in him, the difficulties in relationships, the inability to understand why his jokes hurt, or why his wife felt alone, even with him beside her. He thought he was reading people correctly, but he was actually guessing, filling in gaps with assumptions that were often wrong. It wasn't lack of love. It was a brain that simply didn't process the emotional world the same way others did. He spent over 50 years blaming himself for something that was never entirely his fault. Think about what that means. Imagine living your entire life feeling like you're failing at something everyone else finds easy. Imagine watching your marriage fall apart and not understanding why. Imagine your children looking at you with disappointment and not knowing what you did wrong. Imagine being called cold, distant, unfeeling, when inside you're desperate to connect but don't have the tools. That was Chris Rock's reality for 5 decades. The diagnosis brought clarity, but also grief. Grief for all the relationships that might have survived if he'd known earlier. Grief for the version of himself he could have been with proper support. Grief for the years lost to misunderstanding. And then came that slap. March 27th, 2022, the Oscars. Chris was presenting Best Documentary, doing what he'd done thousands of times before, working a room. He made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, referencing G.R. Jane. It wasn't his best material, but it wasn't meant to be vicious. He didn't know she had alopecia. He didn't know it was a sensitive subject. Remember, reading social cues isn't his strength. Before he could process what was happening, Will Smith walked across the stage and struck him. The sound echoed through the Dolby Theatre. The world froze. Chris Rock froze. Not out of cowardice, but because his body recognized the situation. It was Brooklyn again. It was school again. It was public humiliation again. And, as he always did, he smiled, finished the job, and kept the pain inside. He presented the award, made a few more comments, and walked off stage like a professional. But backstage was different. People who were there said he was shaking. He kept touching his face, not because it hurt physically, but because he couldn't process what had just happened. Had that really occurred? In front of everyone. And nobody stopped it. For someone with his history, that moment was annihilating. It confirmed every childhood fear that he wasn't safe, that he couldn't protect himself, that authority wouldn't help him, that humiliation could come at any moment. This time, the armor cracked. In the following months, he disappeared. Friends said he barely spoke, that he wandered around his house aimlessly, that for the first time in decades, he was afraid to return to the stage. The slap exposed a brutal truth. Even rich, famous, and respected, he remained that boy who didn't know how to defend himself. The world wanted him to respond with anger, with lawsuits, with vengeance. But Chris Rock doesn't know how to do that. He knows how to absorb pain, bury it, and transform it into material later. He knows how to keep moving. He knows how to survive. So that's what he did. He took time off, went back to therapy, processed what he could, and slowly, carefully, he returned to the stage. Not because he was healed, but because the stage is the only place he knows how to breathe. Today, at 60, Chris Rock is alone. His daughters grew up and left home. Lola is in college. Zara is pursuing her own path. They love him, but they have their own lives now. The mansion in New Jersey that was once full of family noise is empty. He walks through rooms that echo. He sits at a dining table meant for 8 and eats alone. He tours the world, receives ovations, but when the lights go out, he returns to identical and silent hotel rooms. There's no more Molac, no family waiting, no one traveling with him. He has friends, sure, but friendship at this level of fame is complicated. How do you know who actually cares about you versus who cares about what you represent? How do you trust people when you can't read their emotional signals accurately? How do you build intimacy when your brain works differently than most people's? There's a photo that's circulated online and broke hearts. Chris leaving a show through the back door. Alone, no security, no entourage, no friends, just a phone in his hand. He walks through the night looking less like a legend and more like a man who traveled too far and realized he has no one left to come home to. His social media is carefully curated, all professional, no glimpses of personal life, because there isn't much personal life to share. He works, he exercises, he writes, he performs. That's the routine. That's what keeps him going. Some nights, after shows, he sits in his hotel room and thinks about calling someone. But who? Everyone he knows is busy with their own families, their own lives. He could call his siblings, but they have their own struggles. He could call old friends, but what would he say? That he's lonely. That despite everything he's achieved, he feels like he's failed at the things that matter most. Chris Rock's tragedy isn't the slap, isn't the divorce, isn't the violent childhood. The tragedy is that he spent 60 years making the world laugh, and almost nobody noticed how many times he had to cry to achieve it. He didn't fall. He's just tired of carrying alone the weight of being Chris Rock. He's tired of being the strong one, the funny one, the one who takes the hit and keeps going. He's tired of translating a world he can't quite understand, of pretending he's fine when he's barely holding together. 60 years of armor is heavy. 60 years of performance is exhausting. And now, in the quiet of his empty house, he wonders if it was worth it. He made history. He inspired generations. He spoke truths that needed speaking. But some nights, when the awards are locked away and the acclaim feels distant, he would trade it all for one thing he never quite learned how to have: connection. Real, honest, uncomplicated connection with another human being who sees him not as Chris Rock the legend, but as Chris, the man who's still trying to figure out how to stop running from the scared kid in Brooklyn.